Check. The Queen's Gambit, a triumph of the small screen, still has people talking even months after its release. This unlikely drama set viewership records on Netflix, and it's been credited with a resurgence of interest in chess. Indeed, according to an article in the Wall Street Journal, the show prompted both unprecedented signups to the chess.com platform as well as unprecedented sales of physical chess sets. Even now, more than 3 months after its release, chess players, including world-class grandmasters, including the world champion, are still discussing it and analyzing the games depicted. But, I hear you ask, why are we talking about it on the Phobophile channel? After all, this is a horror channel, and neither the Queen's Gambit nor the game of chess have anything to do with horror, right? Well, that's where you'd be wrong. Maybe I'm just stretching the bounds of genres so I can discuss a show and a game that I genuinely enjoy, but I think there are some interesting connections between both the Queen's Gambit and horror, and between chess and horror. So let's dive in and start discussing. Perhaps the most obvious place to start is with movies. One of the things that set the Queen's Gambit apart so much is that it's one of the rare films, perhaps even the very first film, to really accurately portray the game of chess both on and off the board. Cinema in general tends to use chess as a shorthand for this character is intelligent and then gets the game wrong. Within the horror genre, for instance, The Silence of the Lambs, one of the finest films ever made to be sure, still didn't get the game of chess right. In the scene in which Clarice visits the entomologists, we find them playing chess with beetles. An amusing scene to be sure, except that the board is set up sideways. The same mistake occurs in The Shawshank Redemption, which, while not a horror story itself, is based on a story by horror maestro Stephen King. Indeed, incorrect board setups, nonsensical moves, and general misunderstandings of chess are common in cinema, particularly when the game is just incidental to the plot. But are there any great horror movies where chess plays a larger role? Indeed there are. I've collected some of the best chess-related horror movies, and I'm going to discuss each in turn. Let's begin with an example that comes down to a single scene rather than an entire movie. But it's an important scene. In John Carpenter's The Thing, we find MacReady playing chess against a computer called the Chess Wizard, which is actually just an Apple II. Let's put aside for a moment the fact that the game is completely impossible and both Mac and the computer make nonsensical moves, and the fact that the second time we see the board, it's in a position impossible to reach from the first position shown, because the fact that Carpenter and the rest of the crew didn't bother to get the chess right isn't the point. The actual point, I think, is an interesting one. Mac is losing the game no matter which position we look at. In both cases, the computer, playing black, has checkmate in just a couple of moves. And we do see Mac losing the game. It's his reaction that matters. Immediately upon losing, he accuses the computer of cheating and pours his glass of scotch into the computer. Here, the film is using a simple chess game, however imperfectly rendered it may be, to tell us something about Mac. He'd rather burn the whole thing down than to accept his loss. When the thing starts doing its thing, that's an important character trait for us to know about. I choose to include the thing on this list because I think it's also a good example of life imitating art. The chess scene in The Thing establishes Mac as a lonely, heavy drinker in desperate need of a visit to the barber shop, playing chess out of pure boredom and cabin fever. Well, I think we've all become Mac over the course of the last year or so. I may have finally seen a barber, but there was a period of months when I didn't. And I think we all got plenty of cabin fever and drank plenty of scotch. For many of us, like Mac, chess was a perfect pastime during the horrors of quarantine, and I think that's part of why the game and the Queen's Gambit have resonated so remarkably with so many people. But let's look at some films in which chess plays a more central role. This movie, Headspace, tells the story of a young man who suddenly develops remarkable mental acuity, coincident with migraines and monstrous hallucinations. When people start dying, it becomes less clear whether his hallucinations actually are hallucinations or whether something supernatural is afoot. It's far from the best movie in the world. In fact, were it not for the fact that the character's mental ability is indicated, among other ways, through chess play, it probably wouldn't have even made it onto my radar in the first place. But for a chess player, there actually are some nice scenes. Admittedly, not all of the chess scenes are quite as believable or as beautiful as those in The Queen's Gambit, but they at least don't insult the chess-playing audience, which itself is a surprisingly rare thing for a movie to manage. It also provides an interesting exploration of the intersections between genius, madness, and chess. Though of course most chess players are perfectly sane people, there's certainly been a history of chess geniuses with severe mental issues, and I think the film provides an interesting look at that, while at the same time providing a not entirely unrealistic look at the way chess players do actually sometimes play for a few dollars at a time in public parks. Currently available for streaming on Amazon is a crime horror thriller called Final Move. It's a story about a serial killer who leaves chess pieces with his victims as a calling card and calls himself the Grandmaster. As the plot progresses, the hero ends up playing a sort of chess game against the madman, in which the killer's victims are forced to assume the role of chess pieces. Technically speaking, it's inconsistent. Why, for instance, a movie both made and set in Australia has characters speaking in often inconsistent American accents is never explained, and the plot does take a few weird turns. All of that having been said, it compensates for its flaws with some truly excellent scenes, and a premise that, while not entirely original, is sure to please chess-playing horror fans. My next selection is going to be controversial, because I'm going to call it a horror movie, and many of you are immediately going to dismiss my categorization and even think I've lost my mind. That movie is one of the greatest cinematic masterpieces of all time, and perhaps the quintessential chess movie, and that is Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal. For those of you who don't know, this film tells the story of a knight, Antonius Block, recently returned from the Crusades only to face the plague. He challenges death to a chess game for his life, and the resulting story manages to explore some of the most important themes known to man: faith and doubt, religion, war, plague, love, life, death, family. It's generally classified as a historical fantasy, but I think that's wrong. It's a horror movie. No, there's not a lot of gore or violence. There are no ghosts or zombies. What there is, however, is the perfect intersection between the horrors of history, including the Black Death, witch burnings, the Crusades, and all the other horrifying aspects of the Dark Ages, and the timeless horrors of human existence. No, we don't really see enough of the chessboard to know anything about the fateful game, and yes, even The Seventh Seal unfortunately has one of those erroneous scenes in which the board is set up incorrectly, an unfortunate flaw in an otherwise perfect or near-perfect film. But what we do get is chess as allegory in one of the most straightforward yet impactful examples of the genre. For example, in one scene, Block, thinking he's communicating with a priest but actually speaking with death, explains his plan to win the game through a combined attack with bishop and knight. Death reveals himself and promises to remember the strategy when they meet again to start playing. The lesson seems obvious. As a recently returned crusader, Block should know better than just about anyone that the combined forces of religious faith, the bishop, and military force, the knight, cannot defeat death. More traditionally within the horror genre is a French-Canadian film called 5150 Elm's Way, or in the original French, 5150 Rue des Ormes. In this film, a young man finds himself being held captive by a righteous psychopath and murderer who wants to purge the world of evil people. As what otherwise seems like a fairly standard horror story about captivity progresses, though, the main antagonist is revealed not only to be a far more complicated character than many horror villains can claim, but also to be a chess fanatic. Indeed, he challenges the young man to a game of chess, believing that his righteousness guarantees that he can't lose. If his prisoner defeats him, it means he must set the young man free. Any chess player will tell you that the game often imitates life. This movie takes that idea to the extreme by allowing not only the movie as a whole, but even the chess games depicted within the movie to serve as mechanisms to explore such fascinating topics as morality and justice, not necessarily always the same thing, but also family, religion, intelligence, and madness, which we've already established are sometimes coincident, and even the kind of obsession that chess players are certain to understand. Perhaps even more than the other horror films I've mentioned, this one will appeal both to chess players and Queen's Gambit fans because its plot captures some of what we can call the simplistic complexity of the game, and its characters are as rich, complicated, and multifaceted as those in The Queen's Gambit. It's very much a thinking man's kind of horror movie. I actually only discovered it while researching films to make this video, and I'm certainly glad I did. It's become a recent favorite. Of course, there are other chess movies. Searching for Bobby Fischer is a classic example. There are also movies like Delusion Defense, Pawn Sacrifice, and even a documentary about Magnus Carlsen called Magnus. Still, the world of chess movies is rather small, and the world of chess horror movies is even smaller. But we're not limited to only big professional productions. Even right here on YouTube, there's a small number of short horror films related to chess. They boast varying degrees of success, and there are also narrated stories or creepypastas such as The Legend of the Chess Slayer, which I've linked to down in the What's It. Because this video is both about chess in general and about the Queen's Gambit though, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that Anya Taylor-Joy, star of The Queen's Gambit, has also appeared in quite a large number of horror films for someone so early in her career. Of the 14 feature films listed on her IMDb page, no fewer than 7 of them are listed within the horror genre. 8 if you count an uncredited appearance in Vampire Academy. Among those are The New Mutants, Split, Morgan, which is an interesting kind of sci-fi horror thriller, Marrowbone, which caught me completely by surprise and deserves a much larger audience than it received, and of course, The Witch, about which I initially had mixed thoughts, but which has grown on me quite a lot on subsequent viewings. Additionally, she appears in Last Night in Soho, a psychological horror film slated for release later this year, and I'm told will star in the upcoming remake of 1922's Nosferatu. What about actual chess stuff? Is there any horror in the actual game of chess itself? Well, that's a more difficult question. Of course, there are a few horror-themed chess sets available on the market, some mass-produced and some painstakingly handcrafted for the collector's market, and they exhibit varying degrees of success, but when I went searching, I was actually shocked to discover how relatively few in number these chess sets are. All you chess-playing horror nerds out there will be able to find some chess sets to combine your passions, but finding one that matches your own aesthetic will take more of an effort than you might expect. And since I am also a collector of chess sets, both cheap and expensive, both traditional and novelty, for the love of God, please leave me a note in the comments if you ever happen to find a good horror-themed set on the market. One chessboard I want to highlight in particular is the Square Off board, which you can see me and Dr. McCoy using in footage I took around Halloween. Though computerized chessboards are nothing new, the Square Off people have created, I think, the best version to date. The board, a very nice traditional board with wooden pieces, features a mechanism that actually moves the pieces automatically, using magnetic connections to the apparatus beneath the board's surface. You can connect either to the computer, which plays at a variety of difficulty levels, or to actual human players anywhere in the world, including those on chess.com, using the Square Off app for your phone or tablet. And depending on which version you decide to buy, it will even reset the pieces for you. Yes, moves, and especially resetting the board, takes longer this way than in a normal game of chess. But for a novelty product, this one really excels at every level. From a chess perspective, this is a godsend for someone like me who can't always find a game in person, but very much prefers a real board rather than simply playing on two-dimensional computer screens. From a horror perspective, admittedly the board itself is far from scary, but I do have to say that with the right setting and something to cancel out the mechanism's noise, this product comes the closest to any that I've seen yet to the effect of actually playing chess with a ghost. What about the game itself? Is it possible to actually have some horror on the chessboard? Well, if you make a mistake, of course, almost any position has the potential to turn into a chess player's nightmare, and there might be nothing scarier than getting checkmated by your opponent's pawn. But beyond that sort of intellectual horror, there are actually a couple of horror-themed chess openings. This video is not the time or place to go into any great detail on opening theory, and I want to keep this video interesting even to people who don't obsess over chess, so I'm only going to outline these openings in the broadest possible terms, and then I'll link you to some more detailed explanations of the theory down in the What's It for those of you who are interested. I'm aware that my board is actually out of frame, but that's okay because the moves will be appearing on your screen as they play them on the board. Now let's look at these openings. This first opening is actually a variation of the Vienna game, and it's called the Frankenstein-Dracula variation. It was given its name by Tim Harding, who said the variation is so bloodthirsty that it's like a game between Dracula and Frankenstein's monster. The name actually seems appropriate because it leads to complicated and terrifying prospects for both sides. The Vienna game starts with e4, e5, and then knight c3, playing for the center in a fairly traditional way. This is probably not quite as common as knight to f3, but still played regularly. The Frankenstein-Dracula variation then continues with knight to f6, and then bishop c4, and then knight takes e4. This is a pretty surprising move. Black here has apparently sacrificed a full knight, but if white takes back on e4, then d5 wins back the knight, either the knight or bishop because of this fork, and black immediately equalizes the material and ends up with a positional advantage. So instead, white should play queen to h5, threatening mate on f7. Black can counter with knight to d6, protecting against the mate on f7 and simultaneously attacking this bishop on c4. I'm not going to go into the rest of the theory, but one of the things that makes this so scary is that both sides have so many threats in this opening that it requires a certain precision of play from both sides. It's rarely seen in top-level chess, though it has shown up in a few games at that level, and it's particularly scary to players at my level because it's so easy to make a mistake. For instance, probably a large majority of lower-rated players would immediately take the knight on e4, missing the fork that follows with d5. Continuing with our theme of highly aggressive play in the opening, let's look at the so-called Halloween Gambit, which occurs in the Four Knights game. The Four Knights game is a very mellow sort of position that occurs, for instance, after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, knight f6. It's a symmetric position, both players have equal control of the center, and the only real advantage either player seems to have is the tempo that white gets just by virtue of moving first. The Halloween Gambit occurs when white takes the pawn. Knight takes e5. It gets its name because this opening is so shocking and scary that players prepared for a sort of boring Four Knights game end up suddenly faced with a much riskier position. Here, this really is a gambit, and a gambit of a full knight, because black can take back, knight takes e5, and white doesn't have the kind of forking opportunity as in the Frankenstein-Dracula variation. In exchange for the knight, white only gets a pawn of material, but gets control of the center. Here, white should play d4, forcing the knight to retreat. If black retreats to c6 with the knight, white simply plays d5, gaining more control of the center and chasing the knight all over the board. After the knight goes back to e5, white simply plays f4. Then the knight goes back to g6, and d5 chases the other knight back to its starting square. Here, white is down 2 points of material, but has massive control of the center. Black has really only developed a single piece all the way from b8 to g6. White has 3 pawns in the center and a knight developed. Admittedly, white is a little bit overextended in this position, but black is going to have a very hard time defending against white's attack from a position like this. There are other variations in this gambit, such as when black retreats directly to g6 instead of to c6, but they lead to similar positions. You should be aware that this opening isn't really sound, but it does require black to play correctly, and at my level of chess, for instance, that simply isn't a reliable assumption. An example of correct play would look like this. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, knight f6, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, d4, knight back to c6, d5, and here, bishop to b4. This gives up the knight on c6, but it pins white's knight to the king, and black can afford to give up this material because white has already sacrificed the knight in the original gambit. So then after d takes c6, then knight takes e4. At this point, black has won back the pawn and is now applying massive pressure on white's c3 knight. The c3 knight is in big trouble because it's pinned to white's king and it's currently attacked twice but only defended once. And if white tries to defend this position, for instance, queen to d4, defends the c3 knight and also forks black's knight and bishop, then simply queen to e7, defends black's knight and also threatens some discovered checks while white's knight is still pinned. This is a fairly terrifying position now for white. I'm not going to say the game is completely lost at this point, but white is in big trouble. Now let's look at the Vampire Gambit. This is an opening that was actually introduced right here on YouTube by international master Levi Rosman on his channel Gotham Chess. And it's called the Vampire Gambit because white moves the bishop's pawns in a figure that looks sort of like vampire fangs. And it goes like this: c4, e5, f4. There's the vampire fangs. Now this f4 pawn, of course, is hanging, and if black takes, e takes f4, then immediately white will play knight to f3. The goals here are to play d4 and e4, perhaps eventually to take back the pawn with a bishop takes f4, something like that. In exchange for the pawn, basically white is getting control of the center. Now here, black should play g5, defending the pawn, and white plays g3. Now here, whether black decides to trade these pawns or not, black is likely going to end up overextended and white is going to end up with strong development in exchange for this pawn. Perhaps strong control in the center or perhaps development on the queen side. For instance, if black takes, white takes back, and that opens up this rook on the h-file. Now I'll be the first to admit I haven't had time to analyze this properly, and there's not enough theory yet for me to simply look it up, but odds are this is probably not a sound opening. But again, when we're playing any of these kinds of horror variations, we're not looking to beat grandmasters. What we're looking to do is to capitalize on the fact that these are scary positions that will get our opponents out of their opening preparation if they are a lower rated player, like the kinds of players in my rating category, for instance. So should you play openings like those? Probably not if you're playing serious games against high-rated players. Some of them are certainly more sound than others, but these are risky kinds of games. That said, the Traxler defense against the fried liver isn't sound either, but you'll win a lot of games with it against weaker players, so I'd certainly say they have their place. Anyway, I like them just because they're fun to play and because they play right into my combined obsessions with chess and horror. A bit of free advice to all of you out there. If you ever plan to play me at chess, you might want to read up on some of these openings, because I don't think I'll be able to resist the temptation to play them from time to time, at least in casual games. Well, that does it. It seems our time together is once again coming to a close. If I've missed any chess-related horror stuff, please do leave me a note down in the comments. While you're at it, please also help me out by clicking the like button and subscribing to my channel so I can keep exploring every facet of the whole wide world of horror. Until next time then, take care and stay scared.